He spent the winter holiday in another woman's bed, and he told himself his wife would never learn of it. Marius Falco came home to a silent house, a cold nursery, and a wife who had walked out into the falling snow with their son. He assumed she had finally stopped forgiving him, that her pride had done what her love never could. But when he pried up the loose board beneath the boy's bed and saw what she had hidden there, he understood she had not run from him at all. She had run to keep their son alive. The lodge stood high in the pine woods above a frozen lake, far enough from the city that the only sound after dark was the slow shifting weight of snow sliding off the steep roof. Marius Falco had bought it under a name that appeared on no paper he had ever signed, and for 11 days each winter he came here to be no one at all. No soldiers waiting in the hall, no ledgers, no telephone ringing with the endless grinding business of the family he had inherited by blood and held by fear. Only Livia. She lay across the wide bed in the grey light of late morning, one bare arm thrown across her eyes, the heavy blankets drawn up around her. She was beautiful the way costly things were beautiful, deliberate and curated and fully aware of the effect she created. Marius had met her in a private card room 2 winters earlier, and he had wanted her the way a man wants something he has been warned he must never touch. That, he had understood even then, was the larger part of it. "You are brooding again," she said, without moving. "You always brood on the last morning. I am thinking about her." It was not a question. Livia drew her arm away and studied him, and there was no jealousy anywhere in her face, only a cool and practiced amusement. "You spend the whole year building walls around this little kingdom so you can forget you have a wife, and then on the final morning you sit at that window and think about her. It is almost tender." Marius did not answer. He stood at the tall window in his open shirt, a cup of black coffee going cold in his hand, and watched the snow come down over the white sheet of the lake. He did not think of Cosima the way Livia imagined. He did not miss her. A man could not miss a thing he had never truly held. His marriage had been arranged across a dinner table when he was 26 years old, and newly the head of everything, a treaty dressed up as a wedding, the binding of his name to the old and careful money of her father's house. Cosima had come to him composed and unsmiling in a pale dress, and she had stayed composed and unsmiling for the 6 years since. She ran his home like a good officer holding a border. She raised their son. She sat at the far end of his long table and passed him the salt when he asked for it. And never once in all that time had she asked him where he had been. He had mistaken that silence for indifference. It had made the whole arrangement easy. He told himself often how fortunate he was to have married a woman who did not need him, because a woman who did not need you could never be used against you. There was the boy, of course. Rowan was 4 years old, small and grave and watchful, with his mother's dark and steady eyes and a habit of going quiet in a room full of loud men, like a clever animal going still. Marius loved him. He was almost certain of that, but he loved him the way he loved the sea view from his study, from a distance, through glass, as a fine thing that belonged to him and required nothing further. He had missed the boy's first birthday for a shipment at the docks. He had missed the second for a war with the river families. He kept meaning to be a different sort of father starting the following week, and the following week had a way of never arriving. Cosima never reproached him for any of it. That, he had decided, was a kindness. He understood now, far too late, that it had never been kindness at all. It had been a woman quietly learning that there was no help coming and making her plans accordingly. "Come back to bed," Livia said. "You have hours yet. I leave at noon. You always leave at noon." She said it lightly, but something moved behind her eyes as she said it, quick and then gone, the way a fish turns once under dark water and vanishes. Marius did not see it. He had spent 20 years training himself to read the faces of dangerous men across tables, and it had never once occurred to him to read hers. He set the cold coffee on the sill and began to dress. It was the last day. In a few hours he would drive the long road down out of the pines, and he would fold the lodge and the woman inside it back into the sealed compartment where they lived for the other 354 days of the year, and he would return to the estate on the coast and become once more the man the city was afraid of. There was a ritual to the last morning, one he had come to lean on without ever giving it a name. At noon, every year his wife sent him a single message. It was never warm, it never asked him for anything. It confirmed only that the household still stood, that the boy was well, that the accounts had cleared and the men had been paid and nothing in his world had cracked open while his back was turned. Cosima had the exactness of a good blade. In 6 years she had never once been a minute late. He carried his telephone to the window and turned it on for the first time in 11 days. He waited for it to wake and find the signal, and he watched the small pale clock in the corner of the screen. It read 1:15. There was no message from his wife. He told himself it meant nothing. A dead spot in the mountains. A tower brought down under the weight of the snow. He finished dressing and did not say goodbye to Livia, because they had never once said goodbye. And he drove the long white road down out of the pines with the heater roaring and the telephone lying face up on the seat beside him, silent the whole way. By the time the coast came into view, low and grey beneath a sky the color of an old bruise, he had called the house 4 times. No one had answered. That, more than the missing message, was what turned the unease in his gut to something colder and heavier. Someone always answered. There were 9 people on that estate whose whole purpose in life was to answer. The iron gates stood open. Marius sat in the car at the mouth of the long drive for a moment, the engine ticking as it cooled, and looked at those open gates. In all his years they had never once stood open with no man beside them. He drew the pistol from the holster beneath his coat, laid it across his thigh, and rolled through slowly. The great house was dark. There were no lamps burning in the windows against the dying afternoon, no smoke rising from the kitchen chimney, no sound at all but the wind coming off the water and worrying at the bare black trees along the drive. He left the car door hanging open behind him and went up the wide stone steps with the gun held low against his leg, and he pushed the front door and found it unlocked. Inside, the silence had a shape to it. It was not the ordinary hush of a sleeping house. It was the silence of a place that people had left in a hurry and did not mean to come back to. He found the housekeeper in the kitchen. Renata had served his family since before he was born, and she sat now at the servants' table with her heavy coat buttoned to the throat and her hands folded on the wood in front of her, as though she had been sitting there a long while waiting for someone exactly like him to walk through the door. She did not stand when she saw him. "They are gone," she said. "The mistress and the little one. 2 nights past, in the dark." Marius set the gun down on the table between them. "Where?" The old woman shook her head slowly. She did not say. She came to the kitchen near midnight with the boy already dressed for the cold, and she sent every one of us home. She paid us each 3 months in cash from her own hand, and she told us not to speak of it, and not to come back until we were sent for. Renata's eyes were wet, but her voice did not shake. "I have known that girl 6 years, Marius. I have never seen her frightened. She was frightened that night, not of you." She looked at the doors the whole time she spoke to us, as though she expected something to come through them. Something cold moved down the back of his neck. He was still standing there when he heard the car in the drive, and a moment later Ambrose came through the front of the house calling his name, unhurried, at ease, the way a man walks through a house he has already decided belongs to him. Ambrose had been his father's closest friend, and had been Marius his whole life, the nearest thing to a father of his own, the old consigliere who had taught him which men to trust and which to bury. He took in the dark kitchen and the frightened housekeeper and the gun on the table with one slow sweep of his grey eyes. "She has left you, cousin," Ambrose said gently, spreading his hands. "I am sorry to be the one to say the plain thing. A woman gets tired. She has taken the boy to her father's people across the water, and she is making you feel it." He came closer and lowered his voice with great tenderness. "Let her have her tantrum. We will send men to bring the child home when the road's clear. But I will tell you honestly, she was never truly one of us. Cold blood in that one." "You always knew it." Marius said nothing. He was thinking of a night 3 winters ago, a night Ambrose had never known about, when a captain from the river families had come to the house while Marius was away and had sat at that very table and threatened the boy in Cosima's hearing to force a change in the shipping routes. Cosima had poured the man coffee. She had smiled. And by the following morning that captain had signed away his entire southern dock to the Falco name and had left the city forever, and to this day Marius did not fully understand how she had done it, only that she had done it alone, and had never once mentioned it, and had passed him the salt at dinner the next evening as though nothing in the world had happened. Cold blood, yes. That was one word for what his wife had. "Come," Ambrose said, a hand settling warm on his shoulder. "There is nothing here. Come away, and we will deal with it in the morning like sensible men." Marius did not move. because a thought had arrived in him, quiet and terrible, and it would not leave. He crossed the dark house to the small locked room behind the study where the recordings from every camera on the estate were kept, and he opened it, and he sat down at the screen and called up the footage from 2 nights before. Every frame from that night was gone, wiped clean down to black, and so far as Marius knew, only 2 men living had the code that could do such a thing. He was one of them. He turned in the chair and looked back through the dark doorway at the old man waiting patiently for him in the hall. He did not let his face change. It was the first thing his father had ever taught him, and the last thing he would ever forget, that the face is a door, and a man decides for himself who walks through it. So Marius turned in the chair, away from the wiped black screen, and let the old man in the doorway see only what the old man wished to see. A husband, tired and shamed, undone by the leaving of a woman he had not bothered to love. "You are right," Marius said. "There is nothing here tonight." Ambrose smiled, and it was a kind smile, and that was the worst of it. "Go and rest, cousin. Grief makes fools of stronger men than you. I will put 2 of my own boys on the gate, and I will come to you in the morning, and we will decide together how to bring your son home." He pressed his dry lips to the top of Marius's head, the way he had done when Marius was a child at his father's funeral, and then he was gone, his footsteps unhurried down the long hall, and the front door closed behind him with a soft and final sound. Marius sat still and counted to 200. He listened to the car start in the drive, listened to the tires turn on the gravel, listened to the engine climb the hill and thin out into the wind and disappear. Then he rose, and he did not go to his bed. He went up the dark stairs to the nursery. The room was cold. She had taken the small warm things, the blankets, the boy's coat, the stuffed grey rabbit that Roan could not sleep without, and left the rest exactly as it always was, so that a man glancing in from the hall would think the child was only away for a night. Marius stood in the doorway a long moment. He had been inside this room perhaps a dozen times in 4 years. He was ashamed to find that he had to think about which was the boy's bed. He crossed to it and knelt, and he ran his hand along the floor beneath it the way a man searches a body, and near the wall his fingers found the edge of a board that sat a hair too proud of the others. He worked his nails into the seam. The board lifted. Beneath it, in the dust and the dark, lay a flat metal tin of the kind that had once held sweets, and inside the tin was a cheap telephone he had never seen, switched off, and a thick fold of papers, and a single sheet of writing in his wife's small and perfect hand. He read it kneeling on the cold floor. "If you are reading this," she had written, "then you have come home and you have thought to look in the one place your men would never think to look, which means the part of you I once believed in is still alive somewhere under all the rest. Listen to me now, the way you never once listened to me across your table. I did not leave you. I ran. And I took Rowan. Because I found what Ambrose has done. He has sold our name to Conrad Vale. The price of the deal is the bloodline. That means our son, Marius. That means a 4-year-old boy. I could not reach you. Your telephone has been dark for 11 days, and I know exactly where you go and who you go to when it is dark, and I made my peace with that long ago, but I could not stake our child's life on your answering. So I emptied the cameras myself, so that Ambrose would waste a day chasing the wrong roads, and I have gone to ground somewhere he cannot imagine me. The proof is under this paper. Take it to no one inside this house. Trust no one who has ever eaten at your table. And if you want to find us, think back, if you are still capable of it, to the place you took me the first spring, before you decided I was only a treaty with a pulse. I will wait there as long as I can. I cannot wait forever. Come alone, or do not come at all." Marius read it twice. Then he sat back against the small cold bed with the paper in his hand, and stared at nothing for a while, and something in his chest that had been packed in ice for 6 years cracked straight down the middle. She had known about Livia the whole time. She had known, and she had said nothing, and she had run into the winter with their son to do the one thing he had failed to do, which was to keep the boy alive. He unfolded the papers. Bank routings he recognized. Names he recognized. A photograph, taken from a distance through a long lens, of Ambrose shaking the gloved hand of a heavy silver-haired man on a snowbound pier, and Marius did not need to be told the man's name, because every soldier in the city knew the face of Conrad Vale. He took out his own telephone and he called the one number in the world he was still certain of. It rang once. "Gideon," he said, "wake up. Bring the fast car and no one else, and tell no one, not your mother, not your priest, not the men on my gate." His voice had gone very quiet and very level, the voice he used in the last moment before a room turned to blood. "We are going to find my wife. And then we are going to burn down everything I have spent my life protecting." They drove north through the last of the night and into a grey and grudging dawn, and with every mile the country grew harder and poorer and more honest. Gideon drove and did not speak, which was among the reasons Marius trusted him above every other living soul. The estates and the gated lanes fell away behind them. The land flattened into salt marsh and dead reed, and then into a coastline of shut canneries and boarded houses, of gas stations with plywood in their windows, and churches with their doors chained. The whole north shore emptied out and left to the gulls and the wind for the long dead months of the winter. Sable Point. He had not spoken the name aloud in 6 years. He had not let himself think it. He had brought her there the first spring of their marriage, before he understood that a man in his position was not permitted to want the woman he had been given. His mother had been born in that town, in a narrow room above a bait shop on the harbor, and he had taken Cosima there for 1 honest week, the only week of their marriage in which he had not been the head of anything. They had eaten fried fish out of paper by the frozen water. She had laughed at something he said once, and the sound of it had frightened him so badly that he had spent the following 6 years making certain he never heard it again. He had told no one on this earth about that week, not his men, not Ambrose, not Livia. It belonged to no one but the two of them, which was exactly why she had chosen it. She had known he would understand. She had gambled her son's life on the belief that some ruined and buried part of Marius Falco could still be reached. The car ate the miles, and as the dead town slid past the window, the memory he had been holding underwater for 11 days finally came up for air, and it was worse than he had let himself fear. The morning he had left for the lodge, Cosima had come to his study. She never came to his study. She had stood in the doorway in the grey morning with her hands folded in front of her, and she had asked him, in her flat and careful voice, not to go this year. Just this once, she had said, "Stay this year." And he had not even turned around. He had been choosing a watch. He had told her that the arrangements were made, that a man did not break his habits because his wife was feeling the cold, and he had asked her, cruelly, whether she had somewhere she would rather he was. She had gone quiet. And then Roan had come padding in behind her in his small socks and had taken hold of the leg of his father's trousers and looked up at him with those steady dark eyes and asked, "Are the bad men coming while you are gone?" And Marius had laughed. He had actually laughed and ruffled the boy's hair and said, "There are no bad men," and he had picked up his bag and driven into the mountains to another woman without once asking himself how a 4-year-old child had learned to ask that question. She had been trying to tell him. Both of them had. And he had chosen a watch. Marius pressed the heel of his hand hard against his sternum, against the thing that was clawing its way up out of the ice, and he made himself breathe. "Boss," Gideon said quietly. It was the first word either of them had spoken in an hour. Up ahead, Sable Point came out of the snow the way a shipwreck comes out of fog, low and grey and half surrendered to the sea. The harbor was a sheet of dirty ice. The single street of the town was empty, drifted over, the street lamps long dead, and every window black. Gideon killed the headlights and let the car roll the last stretch on its own weight, tires crunching on the frozen crust, until the old rooming house above the shut bait shop stood before them at the dead end of the street, exactly where it had stood for 100 years. There was a light in the highest window. It was not a lamp. It was the small, careful, shielded light of a single candle, set back from the glass so that it would not be seen from the water, and it was moving very slightly, as though someone were carrying it back and forth across a room in the dark, over and over, the way a person walks who has not slept in days and no longer trusts the floor to hold. Marius was out of the car before it had fully stopped. He crossed the frozen street with his gun in his hand and his heart slamming against his ribs, and he went in through the swollen door of the bait shop and up the black and groaning stairs 2 at a time, and at the top he found a door, and behind that door he heard the small sound that undid him completely. A child crying and a woman's voice, cracked and worn down to almost nothing, softly singing to make it stop. He did not kick the door. Some instinct older than his training stopped his boot in the air. He put his hand flat against the wood instead, and he said her name, once, low, the way a man speaks to a horse in a burning barn. "Cosima." The singing stopped. There was a long and terrible silence on the other side of the wood, and then the small dry sound of a hammer being drawn back on an old revolver, and her voice came through the door, flattened and hollowed out into something he had never heard from her in 6 years. "If you are not alone," she said, "I will put the first one through the door and the second through my own eye before I let you take him. So think very carefully about what you say next." "I am alone," Marius said. "Gideon is below at the car, and no one else on this earth knows where you are." He pressed his forehead to the freezing wood. "I read your letter. I found the tin under the bed. Cosima, I came the moment I understood. Open the door, please." He had never in his life said that word to her. In 6 years he had commanded her, and thanked her, and ignored her, and he had never once begged her for anything, and he heard the word land on the other side of the door like a stone dropped into a deep well. A chair scraped, a bolt slid. The door opened the width of a hand, and one dark eye looked out at him over the shaking barrel of the gun, and then the eye filled, and the barrel dropped, and the door swung back, and Marius Falco looked into the room where his wife had been keeping their son alive, and the sight of it drove the breath out of him as surely as a blade. The room was barely warmer than the street. There was no heat. The single small window was stuffed around its frame with newspaper and rag to hold back the wind, and the candle he had seen from below sat guttering in a saucer on the sill. There was no furniture but a bare mattress on the floor and a single wooden chair, the one she had wedged beneath the door handle. And on the mattress, buried under every blanket in the room, and under both of the coats she had carried out of the estate, and under her own thin coat as well, was Roan, awake, his small face blotched with crying and cold but whole, entirely whole, alive, reaching up out of the heap of wool toward the doorway with both arms. "Papa," the boy said. "Papa, Papa." Marius crossed the room on his knees. He did not remember dropping down to them. He gathered his son up out of the blankets, and the boy's arms went around his neck and locked there, and the small body was cold, too cold, but it was breathing, and it was clinging to him, and it was saying his name into his collar over and over, and Marius held him and could not for a moment do anything else at all. When he could see again, he looked up at his wife. Cosima had backed against the far wall with the emptied revolver hanging from her hand. In the candlelight, she was a ruin. She wore only a thin gray sweater against the killing cold, because every warm thing they owned was on the boy, and her lips had gone the pale blue of a drowned woman. She had not slept. He could see that at once, not in days. Her eyes were sunk and rimmed in bruised shadow, and they moved constantly even now. To the window, to the door, to the boy, to the door again. The ceaseless scanning of a soldier who has held a line alone too long to remember how to stop. Her hands, when he looked at them, were split and blistered across the knuckles, and there was a dark, stiff patch of dried blood high on her left sleeve that was not the boy's and was not from any accident. Someone had found them. Somewhere on that long flight north, someone had found them, and this woman, this administrator, this treaty with a pulse, had stood between that someone and her child and had won, and had picked the boy back up and kept running, and had told no one, and had waited in a freezing room at the end of the world for a husband who might not even bother to come. "You are hurt," he said. His voice did not sound like his own. "It is nothing." Her teeth were chattering so hard she could barely shape the words. "A man came the second night, outside the reeds below the old cannery. He was not expecting me to be the one who fought." She looked at the revolver in her hand as though she had forgotten it was there, and then she looked back at him, and the exhaustion in her face cracked open into something raw and furious. "You were with her," she said. 11 days I could not reach you. 11 days I sat in the dark with a gun across my knees while your son asked me where his father was, and you were with her." "Yes," Marius said. He did not look away from her. He had spent his whole life making other men hold his gaze while he told them the truth about themselves, and he owed her at least as much. "Yes, I was." He put the boy gently down into the blankets again, and he stood, and he crossed the small room to her, and she did not move away, only watched him come with that terrible steady stare, and when he reached her, he took off his heavy coat, the good wool coat worth more than every stick of furniture in that ruined town, and he wrapped it around her thin and shaking shoulders, and drew it closed at her throat with both his hands. "I have been a blind man," he said quietly. "I built walls to keep from being used, and behind those walls the one person who never once tried to use me stood guard over the only thing in my life worth protecting, and starved and bled, and I did not see it. I did not see you." He held the collar closed. I see you now. Something went out of her then, the rigid line of her spine. The thing that had held her upright for 11 days on no food and no sleep and no help simply gave way all at once, the way a rope gives when the last thread parts. Her knees buckled. Marius caught her before she reached the floor, gathered her up against his chest inside his own coat, and she weighed almost nothing, and that weightlessness enraged him and shamed him and broke him all in the same breath because he understood exactly what it meant. She had been giving her food to the boy. She had been giving the boy her warmth and her sleep and her coat and her very body heat, night after night, and keeping nothing back for herself, because she had decided somewhere on that road that if only one of them could walk out of the winter alive, it was going to be their son. From the mattress, Roan watched his parents with his mother's grave dark eyes, and he did not cry now. He had stopped crying the moment his father came through the door, as though some deep animal part of him had decided the siege was finally over. Cosima's lips moved against Marius's collarbone. He had to bend his head to hear it. "He is 4," she whispered. "Marius, he is only 4. And they put a price on him." She fisted her ruined hand weakly in the front of his shirt. "Promise me. Promise me you will make it so no one can ever put a price on our boy again." "I promise you," Marius said into her frozen hair. And then, because there was one thing left that she did not yet know, one thing that would decide everything that came after, he held her tighter, and he made himself say it. "The man who set the price," he told her, "is on his way here now. He has been 3 steps behind me the whole way north, and he is bringing everyone." Below them in the street the car horn sounded once, short and low, the signal they had agreed on for trouble. Marius was already moving. He wrapped the boy in the whole heap of blankets, until only his face showed, lifted him against one shoulder, and took Cosima's arm across the other, and they went down the black stairs together into the freezing dark. Gideon stood by the open car door with his eyes on the coast road. "Headlights," he said quietly. 3 sets, maybe 4, coming slow on the ice. They are still the far side of the marsh. We have the better part of an hour before they reach the point." An hour. Marius laid his son on the back seat and his wife beside him and took the front, and Gideon put the car up the frozen hill away from the water, running dark, and Sable Point fell away behind them into the snow. Marius turned in his seat so that he could see both of them, the sleeping boy and the woman holding him, and he said, "Tell me everything. From the beginning. Leave nothing out to spare me. I have no use left for being spared." So Cosima told him, in the low, flat voice of a woman reciting something she had gone over 10,000 times alone in the dark. She had known the shape of it before she had known the substance, she said, because she had seen it once before. Her father's house had not been given to Marius as a treaty out of love. It had been given because her father was already dying from the inside, eaten hollow by a cousin he trusted, and he had married his only daughter into the strongest name on the coast to buy her a wall to stand behind before the roof came down. Cosima had been 19. She had watched the men who smiled at her father's table carry his empire out the back door piece by piece, while he thanked them for their loyalty. She had learned, at 19, the one lesson Marius had needed his whole life and a bleeding wife to begin to learn. The knife never comes from across the table. It comes from the chair beside you. So she had watched. For 6 years, while he thought her cold, she had watched. She read the accounts he never checked. She noticed which men grew rich faster than their work could explain. And in the last days before the holiday, feeding papers into the fire in his study late at night, she had found the thread, and she had pulled it, and the whole tapestry had come apart in her hands. Ambrose had been selling pieces of the family to Conrad Vale for 3 years. And the final payment, the one that closed the deal and handed Vale the whole coast, was not money. It was the removal of the bloodline. It was an empty nursery, and a widowed treaty, and a grieving old consigliere left standing to inherit what he swore to protect. And it was almost done, she told him. The 2 men were to meet in 3 nights' time, on neutral ground at the old customs house on the North Pier, to sign the last of it over, and to confirm with their own eyes that the heir had been dealt with. Ambrose would bring the deeds and the account codes. Vale would bring the price. Neither man intended to walk away from that room still owing the other anything. If the boy were gone by then, the coast would change hands in an evening, and no soldier in the city would ever know a war had been fought. Marius sat very still in the dark of the car. "There is one more thing," Cosima said, and here her steady voice failed her just slightly at the edges. The reason I could not simply wait for you. The reason I could not risk one telephone call to the lodge. She looked down at the sleeping boy so that she would not have to look at her husband. Your Livia belongs to Vale. She has belonged to him since before you ever saw her across that card table. She was placed in your path like a coin on a road. Every year for 2 winters you have carried your own whereabouts and your own habits and your own blind 11 silent days straight into the bed of the woman feeding them to the man who wants our son dead. That is how they knew the exact window. That is how they knew you would be dark and unreachable and 100 miles away. She finally raised her eyes to his. I did not run from your mistress out of jealousy, Marius. I ran because your mistress was the door they were going to come through. Something cold and enormous turned over in Marius's chest, and then went very, very still. He did not rage. He had passed some final gate, somewhere on the black stairs of that rooming house, beyond which rage was no longer of any use to him. What sat in him now was colder and older and far more patient. Why, he said. His voice had gone rough. Not why did you run? I understand why you ran. Why did you never once in 6 years let me see any of this? The watching, the fear, what you carried. You let me believe you were made of ice. Why? Cosima was quiet for a long moment, the tires humming on the frozen road. Because need is a debt, she said at last, and in my father's house I watched what happened to everyone he was in debt to. I decided when I was 19 that I would never again be a thing that could be collected. She pulled the blankets higher around the boy. If I had come to you weeping, you would have handled me the way you handle everything, from a distance, through glass, and I would have become one more liability for you to manage. So I made certain I was never a liability. I made certain I was the one thing in your house that never needed managing. I did not know how to be loved by you, Marius. So I settled for being indispensable, and I told myself it was the same thing, and it was not. They drove the rest of the way in silence. The place Marius took them was a low farmhouse at the end of an unmarked track, far back from any road that had a name, where an old woman and her grown sons kept goats and asked no questions of the world. They were his mother's people. He had not spoken to them in 20 years, and they took him in without a single word, the way blood takes in blood, and the old woman lifted the sleeping boy from Cosima's arms as though she had been waiting his whole life to do it. Roan half woke at the door. He looked around the strange warm kitchen with his grave dark eyes, and then he lifted his head and said in a small clear voice, "My rabbit." Cosima went rigid. In the running and the cold and the terror she had left the grey rabbit behind on the mattress at Sable Point, the one thing the boy could not sleep without, and Marius watched the failure of it land on her face harder than any wound she had taken, as though this small thing and not the blood on her sleeve were the true measure of how much the winter had cost her. Marius knelt down in front of his son. He took the boy's cold face in both of his hands, and for the first time in the child's whole life he gave him his full and undivided attention, and he made him a vow he intended to keep. "I am going to go and get your rabbit," he said. "And on the way, I am going to have a conversation with the bad men. And after tonight, Roan, I promise you there are not going to be any more bad men. Not ever again." The king's kitchen emptied around him. The old woman carried Roan up to a warm bed. Cosima was made to sit by the stove with a bowl of goat stew she was too far gone to lift, and one of the sons crouched and fed it to her a spoon at a time as though she were a child herself, and she let him, which told Marius more than anything how close to the end of her strength she had run. Marius went out alone into the freezing yard, and he took from his coat the cheap telephone from the tin under his son's bed, the one Cosima had left him, and he turned it on. There was one number saved in it. He understood, looking at it, that she had thought of even this, that she had left him not only the proof, but the weapon and the aim. He dialed Ambrose. The old man answered on the second ring, and his voice was thick with false sleep and false worry. "Marius, thank God. My boy, where are you? I have had men on every road since dawn." Marius closed his eyes. He let his breath go ragged. He reached down into the deepest and coldest room in himself, the room his father had built there, and he brought up something that sounded exactly like a man whose heart had been torn out. "I found them," he said. Silence on the line. Careful silence. "Where?" Ambrose said gently. "Marius, where did you find them?" "In the snow," Marius said, and he let his voice break on the word, and it was not entirely a performance because the image he was describing was one he had come within 1 hour and one candle of finding true. Off the north shore, someone got to them on the road. My wife and my son. Someone got to them first, Ambrose. They are gone. And then Marius stood in the frozen dark, and he listened to the man who had taught him to shoot, the man who had pressed dry lips to his hair at his father's grave, receive the news that a 4-year-old boy was gone, and be glad. He heard it. Under the soft words of comfort, under the there, and the my poor boy, and the we will find who did this, and open his throat, Marius heard the thing he needed to hear, the small warm loosening of a man from whom an enormous weight has just rolled away. Ambrose thought the work was done. Ambrose thought the line had ended in the snow. And a man who believes he has already won stops watching the door. Come to me, Ambrose said. Come home and let me take care of the arrangements, the way I took care of your father's. Not yet, Marius said. I cannot look at anyone yet. Give me 3 days. He made his voice small. Ambrose, the thing you and I were building, the understanding with the North, does it still hold? Tell me one thing in my life still holds. It holds, my boy, Ambrose said, and the tenderness in it was obscene. Everything is arranged. 3 nights from now it will all be settled and you will be free of every burden you have ever carried, I promise you. Come and stand beside me when it is signed. Come and let the old world die, and the new one be born with your own name on top of it, where it belongs. I will be there, Marius said. I promise you I will be there. He hung up the telephone. He stood a while in the yard and let the snow fall on his bare head and did not feel the cold. Then he went back inside. Cosima had pushed the bowl away and was watching the door for him, because she was always watching the door, and when he came in she read his face the way she read the accounts, all of it at once. He believes it, she said. He believes we are dead. He believes you and the boy are dead, Marius said, which means from tonight they stop hunting. The child is safe here with my mother's people, safer than he has been in his whole life, because the only men who wanted him gone now think their wish came true. He crossed the warm kitchen and he crouched in front of her chair so that his eyes were level with hers. And in 3 nights, they are going to walk into a room on the North Pier, believing they have already won, unguarded and unafraid, to sign a coast that no longer exists over to each other. And you and I are going to be waiting for them. Cosima looked at him for a long moment. Whatever she saw in his face made her own harden into something to match it. You are going to kill Ambrose, she said. Not a question. He raised you. He raised me to know what to do with a man who sells a child, Marius said. He looked down at his own hands. I have spent my whole life burning down other men's houses to protect this one. Tonight I finally understand there was only ever one thing in it worth protecting, and it was never the house. He stood. In 3 days, I am going to bury the man who buried my father, and then Cosima, for the first time since they put my father's name on me, I am going to be free. For 3 days, the farmhouse at the end of the unmarked track became something Marius had never in his life possessed. It became a home with his family safe inside it. He had not known what to do with the first morning. He woke on a straw mattress in a low room under the eaves with grey light in the window, and no ledger, no gun on the nightstand, no woman he was paying to forget. And for a long moment he did not know who he was without the weight of the name pressing down on him. Then he heard through the floor the small clear voice of his son in the kitchen below, asking the old woman why the goats had square eyes, and something in Marius that had been clenched into a fist since he was a boy at a graveside slowly, painfully, began to open. He went down and he sat on the floor with his son. He did not check a telephone. He did not take a single call. He learned shamefully late how his own child liked his bread, torn and not cut, and which of the goats the boy had already named, and that Roan believed with total conviction that the old brown dog in the yard could understand 3 languages. Marius listened to all of it as though it were the intelligence that would win a war, because he had understood at last that in every way that would ever matter to him again, it was. On the second afternoon the boy fell asleep against his father's chest in the middle of a sentence about the dog, and Marius sat without moving for 2 hours so as not to wake him, his arm gone dead beneath the small warm weight, and he thought that he had knelt in more blood than any man on the coast, and had never once been held in place by anything the way he was held in place now. Cosima slept for the better part of 2 days. Marius sat with her through much of it. On the first night her fever climbed and she thrashed and spoke to people who were not there, to her dying father, to a 19-year-old version of herself, and once terribly to Roan, telling him in a small flat voice to be quiet now. Be quiet, the men are on the stairs. Marius held her hand through all of it and did not let go, and when she finally surfaced on the second evening, clear-eyed and weak in herself, the first thing she did was try to sit up and reach for a pen and paper, because there was work to be done, and the first thing Marius did was take the pen gently out of her hand and set it out of her reach. "The work can wait 1 hour," he said, "while you eat something you do not give away." He fed her himself that evening, the way the son of the house had fed her the first night, a spoon at a time, and she let him, and it was the most honest thing that had passed between them in 6 years of marriage. He cleaned the wound on her arm where the man in the reeds had opened her. It was not deep, but it had gone angry, and as he worked he found the other things her long sleeves had hidden across 6 years, a thin white scar along one forearm, a knuckle that had healed crooked, the small permanent marks of a woman who had been quietly standing between his family and the dark for longer than he had ever bothered to notice. He pressed his thumb once against the crooked knuckle. "The river captain," he said. "3 winters ago, you did not talk him into signing over that dock. You made him." Cosima looked at the wall. "He put his hand on my son's head," she said, "at my own table. I explained to him what would happen to that hand." She turned her eyes back to Marius, and there was no apology anywhere in them. "You were away. Someone had to be the one who did not flinch." "You have been the one who did not flinch for 6 years," Marius said quietly. "And I gave the credit to my own name, and the money to my accounts, and I never once looked at the woman at the end of my table and saw a soldier." He set down the cloth. "I am looking now." On the second noon, out of 6 years of iron habit, she stirred where she lay and reached for a telephone that was not there, and her cracked lips began to shape the words of the message she had sent him at that same hour every year of their marriage. "The household stands, the boy is well, the accounts have cleared." She stopped herself halfway, and a kind of grief crossed her face at the smallness of it, at how she had loved him for 6 years in the only language she had let herself use, a daily report that asked for nothing back. Marius took her hand before she could be ashamed of it. "You do not have to send me the message anymore," he said. "I am not going away again. From now on I will simply be in the room." They planned in the long evenings after the boy was asleep, at the scrubbed kitchen table with the goat lamp between them, and it was there, bent together over the papers from the tin, that Marius finally understood the full size of what he had married. Cosima did not merely know the accounts, she held them. Years ago, quietly, telling no one, she had made herself the second signature on the true reserves of the family, the deep offshore money that Ambrose believed he alone could reach, the money that was the whole substance of what Vale was buying. She had done it, she said, for exactly this. For the day the knife came from the chair beside them, and someone in the house needed to be able to close a fist around everything at once. The code that had wiped the cameras clean had been the same, one quieter key she had cut for herself long ago and never once mentioned. So when Ambrose and Vale walked into the customs house to sign the coast over to one another, Marius said slowly, following it to its end. "They will be signing over an empty box," Cosima said. "I can move all of it in the time it takes them to uncap a pen. Everything they are trading their souls for will already be gone, sitting under a name neither of them will ever find, and they will not know it until long after it no longer matters." She permitted herself, for the first time in the whole ordeal, the ghost of a smile. "Let them have their meeting. Let them sign. They will be dividing a kingdom that belongs, on paper and in full, to a 4-year-old boy who cannot yet tie his own shoes." Marius looked at her across the lamplight, at the bruised and sharpened face of the most dangerous person he had ever sat across a table from, and he felt something he had spent his whole adult life refusing to feel about another human being. He felt safe. "You frighten me," he said. It was not a complaint. "Good," Cosima said. And then it happened, the thing he had spent 6 years making certain he would never hear again. Something he said, or the way he said it, or simply the strangeness of being warm and fed and not yet dead, cracked the exhaustion in her, and she laughed. It was quiet and rough and rusty from disuse, and it undid him more completely than her blood or her fever ever had, because he understood in that moment the true measure of his blindness. He had spent 6 years starving himself of that sound because he had been afraid of what it would cost him to want it. And it had cost him almost everything anyway. On the third night, they dressed in dark clothes in the cold farmhouse kitchen. Marius checked his weapon. Cosima loaded the memory of every rooting number into her head, the way another woman might fix her hair. In the next room, the old woman sat by the fire with the sleeping boy against her shoulder, and she looked up as they made ready to go out into the snow and do the terrible thing that had to be done, and she said only one thing, to Cosima, not to her son. "Bring him back to the boy," she said. "Both of you. That child has waited long enough for his parents to come home." The customs house stood at the far end of the North Pier, a long low building of black brick with tall barred windows, abandoned to the gulls since the port had moved south a generation ago. Snow fell steadily into the sea beyond it, vanishing without a sound into the black water. Marius had come with Gideon and the 2 elder sons of his mother's people, quiet, hard men who had asked only whether it was true about the boy, and had loaded their guns without another word when he said that it was. Cosima came too. Marius had tried for an hour to make her stay with Roan, and she had let him spend the hour, and then put on the dark coat and walked out to the car, and that had been the end of it. His wife did not stay behind. She had only ever made him believe he was the one going forward. They were in place among the rusted cranes long before the meeting. A little before midnight the cars came out along the pier, headlights sweeping the falling snow, unhurried, unafraid, exactly as Marius had known they would be, because men who believe the war is already over do not check the shadows. Ambrose came first, in a heavy fur collar, an old king arriving to collect his reward. Conrad Vale came behind him, silver-haired and enormous and smiling, flanked by 4 of his men. They met in the light of a single lamp inside the customs house and shook hands, and one of Vale's men spread a leather folder of documents across a crate, and Ambrose took out the good pen he had carried to 100 signings, and Marius watched through the barred window as the 2 men who had sold his son bent their heads together to divide the coast between them. He let them sign. "Let them put their names to it," Cosima had said. "Let them believe for 30 seconds that they won. It is the only justice we will ever be able to charge them." So Marius waited until both signatures were dry. Then he walked in through the front door with his gun down at his side, alone, into the light. The room turned to stone. Vale's men reached for their weapons and found, from the dark of the high windows, 3 rifles already trained on them, and Gideon's voice out of the black said the first man to lift a hand paints the wall with the second. Nobody lifted a hand. Ambrose stared at Marius as though at a ghost risen dripping from the harbor. His mouth worked. "My boy," he whispered, "you are alive. Thank God you are alive. I have been out of my mind." "I stop," Marius said. He did not raise his voice. He never would again. "Do not use that word to me. You do not get to thank God in front of me ever again." And then Cosima stepped into the light beside her husband, alive, upright, her dark eyes fixed on the old man. And Marius watched the last of the color drain out of Ambrose's face. Because a clever man understands the whole of his ruin in a single instant, and Ambrose had always been clever. "You," he said. "Me," Cosima agreed. Conrad Vale had not moved. He looked from the woman to the man, to the guns in the dark, did the arithmetic of a lifetime in trade, and spread his enormous hands. "Well," he said, in the reasonable voice of a man used to buying his way off every pier he had ever stood on, "it seems I have paid for goods that were not for sale. Name the number, Falco. Every man in this room has a number." "He does not," Cosima said. She set the cheap telephone on the crate beside the signed and useless deed, and she turned it so the 2 men could see the screen, and with one finger she pressed a single key. Somewhere in a machine on the far side of the world, the deep reserves of the Falco family, the whole substance of everything Conrad Vale had just signed his name to own, ceased to exist at one address and came quietly into being at another, under a name that belonged to a 4-year-old boy, asleep against an old woman's shoulder, with a dog he believed spoke 3 languages curled at his feet. "You have signed for an empty box," Cosima told them, in the flat and precise voice she had used to pass the salt across the table for 6 years. "There was nothing in the account the moment you uncapped your pen. You have traded your lives, both of you, for a piece of paper worth exactly the paper. My husband keeps his ledgers in a place you were never clever enough to look. It was sitting at the end of his table the whole time, and neither of you ever once bothered to read it." Vale began to laugh then, a great helpless rumble, the laugh of a man beaten cleanly and knowing it, and he inclined his silver head to Cosima with something almost like respect. Marius let him laugh. He turned instead to Ambrose, and crossed the cold stone floor until he stood close enough to smell the brandy and the fear, and looked into the eyes of the man who had taught him everything he knew about the world, except the one thing that had turned out to matter. "Tell me it is not true," Marius said. His voice cracked once, and he let it, because he owed the boy he had been that much honesty. "Tell me you did not put a price on Roan. Tell me and I will try, God help me, I will try to believe you." Ambrose looked at him for a long moment, and whatever mercy Marius was holding out died when he saw that the old man was not afraid of the gun. He was only annoyed. He was only sorry that it had not worked. "He was soft," Ambrose said quietly. "Your father was soft at the end, and he made you soft after him, and the child would have been softer still. I have watched this family flinch when the coast needed a closed fist. I did not sell you, Marius. I tried to save the thing your father built from the men your blood keeps producing. The boy was a means." He shrugged, an old man's shrug. "It was never personal. You of all people should understand that." "You are right," Marius said. "I do understand it. And that is the tragedy of your whole life, that you taught it to me and I believed it, right up until the moment I knelt in a freezing room and understood there is nothing on this earth that is not personal." He did not make a speech of it. His father had taught him that too, and it was the last of Ambrose's lessons he would ever use. He raised the gun and ended the man who had raised him, once, cleanly, and caught the old body as it fell and lowered it to the cold floor with a gentleness he had not planned and could not afterward explain. And he knelt there a moment with his hand on the dead man's chest while the snow came in through the open door and settled on them both. Then he stood and turned to Conrad Vale, who had stopped laughing. "Take your men and your worthless piece of paper," Marius said, "and go back to the north. Tell everyone you meet what happens to men who reach for a Falco child, and pray to whatever you pray to that you never see my wife's name on a document again, because she is far less merciful than I am." For a moment nobody moved. Then the youngest of Vale's men lost his nerve in the terrible quiet and went for the pistol under his arm. He never cleared it. Gideon's shot came down from the dark of the high windows, and the boy sat down hard against the crate and did not get up, and after that not one of the others so much as breathed too loudly. Marius let Vale go anyway. A dead Vale was a martyr and a war. A ruined Vale, crawling home stripped of his fortune to men who had watched him swagger north with the coast in his pocket, was a lesson the whole city would read for a generation. Vale gathered his living men and his dead one and his empty paper and walked out into the snow, and the great cars turned on the pier and went back the way they had come, their red lights dwindling along the black water until they were gone. Marius stood a while over Ambrose's body. Cosima came and stood beside him, and she did not tell him he had done the right thing because she was not a liar, and there had been nothing right anywhere in that room. She only put her hand flat against his back, over the old leather of the holster, the way a person steadies something that might otherwise fall. "Take me home," Marius said very quietly. "There is a boy waiting up for us with a dog that speaks 3 languages. And on the way, wife, we are going to stop at a dead town on a frozen harbor, because I made a promise about a rabbit, and tonight I find I am a man who keeps his promises." They stopped at Sable Point on the way home, in the blue hour before dawn, when the snow had finally stopped, and the whole dead town lay hushed and white and almost beautiful under the last of the stars. Marius went up the black stairs alone. He did not let Cosima come. He walked back into the freezing room where his wife had kept their son alive on nothing but her own body and her own refusal to lie down, and he stood in it for a while in the grey light, looking at the bare mattress, the wooden chair still angled from the door, the newspaper still stuffed around the window frame, the saucer with its drowned stub of candle. He made himself see all of it. He made himself understand, fully and without the mercy of looking away, exactly what she had endured in that room while he slept warm 100 miles off, in the arms of the woman who had sold them. Then he crossed to the mattress and picked up the small grey rabbit lying where it had fallen among the blankets, and he held the ridiculous worn thing against his chest with both hands like a man holding something holy, and he wept once, hard, alone, where no one living would ever see it. And then he wiped his face and went back down to his family and did not speak of it, and Cosima, who saw everything, saw that too, and said nothing, and took his hand. They came back to the farmhouse at first light. Before they went in, Cosima stopped him with a hand on his arm in the cold blue yard, and she said the thing she had been carrying since the customs house. I did not know if you would come, she said. She would not look at him. When I chose Sable Point, I told myself I was choosing it because your men would never think of it. That was true. But it was not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I chose the one place on earth that would mean nothing to anyone but you, because I needed to know. If you came, it meant there was still a man in there worth having saved, and if you did not come. She stopped. Her jaw worked. If you did not come, then I would have my answer, and I would raise our son alone, and I would never again waste a single hour of my life wondering what you were. Marius took her face in both his hands. I came, he said. You came, she agreed, and something in her let go a little at the saying of it. The old woman met them at the door with her finger to her lips. The boy was asleep, she said. He had fought it for hours, sitting up at the window watching the track for the car, until his small body had simply overruled him near 4 in the morning, and she had carried him up to bed. Marius went up the narrow stairs and stood in the doorway of the little room under the eaves. Roan lay in the middle of the big bed, one arm flung out across the empty space where he had clearly been reaching for someone who was not there. His dark hair stuck to his forehead, his breath slow and deep. Marius crossed the room as quietly as a man of his size could, and he set the grey rabbit down in the crook of the boy's outflung arm, and in his sleep, without waking, Roan gathered it in against his chest and went still and easy, the last of some deep unconscious vigilance, finally letting go now that the world had been made right in a way he was too young to name. Marius knelt by the bed and watched his son breathe until he was certain of it, the way a man learns to be certain of a thing only after he has come within 1 candle and 1 hour of losing it forever. Behind him, in the doorway, Cosima made a small sound. He turned. She was standing with one hand braced against the frame, and the thing that had held her upright through 11 days of siege and 3 days of planning and 1 long night of blood, the iron spine that had never once, in 6 years, permitted itself to bend in front of him, finally reached the end of what it could carry. It was over. Her son was safe and asleep with his rabbit in his arms, and there was no longer any reason on earth for her to keep standing, and so she stopped. Her legs simply stopped holding her. Marius caught her before she reached the floor. He had caught her twice before that week in the freezing room and in the car, but those had been the collapses of a body running out of fuel, and this was something else entirely. This was the collapse of a wall. She turned her face into his chest and gripped the front of his coat in both her ruined hands, and she wept, at last, the way she had not let herself weep since she was a girl of 19, watching her father thank the men who were burying him, great silent shaking sobs with no sound to them at all. And Marius sank to the floor with her still in his arms and held her through every one of them and did not tell her to stop. You do not have to stand any more, he said into her hair, over and over. I have you. You can put it down now. I have you. You do not have to be the one who does not flinch. I am here. Put it down. He did not know how long they sat on the cold floor of that little room while their son slept above them with a grey rabbit in his arms. Long enough for the sky in the window to go from black to grey to the thin gold of a winter morning. Long enough for 6 years of ice to finish breaking. When at last she quieted, drained down to nothing, he lifted her, and he laid her in the big bed beside the sleeping boy, and he lay down on her other side so that Rowan was between them, and the 3 of them fit there together in a way that the vast cold beds of his vast cold house had never once managed to hold. He did not sleep. He lay and watched his wife and his son breathe in the gold morning light. And somewhere in that quiet hour, listening to the 2 of them, Marius understood that there was still one loose thread left in the world, one person still walking free who had opened his door to the men who wanted this exact bed emptied. And he understood, with the cold, clean certainty that had replaced all his rage, exactly what he was going to do about her. He made the call 3 weeks later, on the first morning the ice began to break on the river below the estate. He had waited on purpose. He had wanted Livia to spend those 3 weeks in the dark, watching Conrad Vale limp home, stripped of a fortune and a coast, feeling the ground shift under her own feet without ever being told why. A frightened asset makes mistakes. By the time Marius finally dialed the number he had once kept in the sealed compartment of his life, he knew she would answer on the first ring, and she did. "Marius," she said, and all the cool amusement was gone out of her voice now, worn down to something thin and watchful. "I heard there was trouble in the north. I've been so worried." "Have you?" he said. He stood at the tall window of his study with a cup of black coffee going cold in his hand, exactly as he had stood at the window of the lodge on the last morning of the old world, and he found that he felt nothing looking down the barrel of this at all. I know what you are, Livia. I have known since the night I came down out of the mountains. You were a coin left on a road for me to pick up, and I picked you up, and I carried you into my own house for 2 winters, and you counted the days I would be blind, and you sold them to the man who wanted my son gone. Silence on the line. Then, carefully, you cannot prove a word of that. I am not going to try, Marius said. That is the beauty of it. I have already spoken to Conrad Vale. He listened to her breathe. I told him that when it all came apart, you came to me. I told him you traded him, every route and every name and every safe house he has north of the river, to buy yourself a place under my protection. I told him you wept when you did it. He took a slow sip of the cold coffee. He believed me, Livia. Of course he believed me. A man like Vale has spent his whole life waiting to be betrayed by the people closest to him, because a man like Vale would betray anyone. That is why he lost. And it is why, by the time you finish this call and try to run, you will find that the only door left open to you is the one you spent 2 years holding open for him. You belong to Vale. I am simply sending you home. He hung up before she could answer, and he dropped the telephone into the drawer and slid it shut, and he did not think of her again. She had wanted to live in the sealed compartments of powerful men. Now she would die in one. It was, he thought, the only honest thing that had ever passed between them. The estate did not go back to what it had been. Marius found he could not stand the sterile perfection of it any more, the beeswax and the filtered air and the long dead table, and so he tore the heart out of the old order and built a new one around a different center of gravity. The men understood quickly that the true power of the family no longer sat at the head of the table. It sat wherever Cosima sat. She kept the books openly now, and the deep accounts stayed exactly where she had put them on the night of the customs house, under the name of a boy who was learning to tie his own shoes, with his mother holding the pen until he was grown. The soldiers who had once called her the Cold One now lowered their voices when she passed, the way men lower their voices near something that has proven it can end them. At dinner, in the new order, Marius sat at Cosima's right hand, and on the first night in the reordered house, out of 6 years of pure habit, she reached to pass him the salt before he could ask for it, the way she had passed it 10,000 times across the long cold distance of their marriage. This time he caught her hand, and he turned it over, and he pressed his mouth to the crooked knuckle that had healed wrong in his service, and he took the salt from her and set it down, and did not let go of her hand for the rest of the meal. She let him hold it. She had stopped somewhere in the melting of the ice, keeping any part of herself in reserve against him. Roan flourished. Children are built to heal, and he healed, and the grave watchfulness in his dark eyes softened week by week into something closer to an ordinary boy's, though he never did give up the grey rabbit, and he never did fully lose the habit of counting the people he loved when they came into a room. One night in the spring, when Marius came to sit on the edge of his bed the way he did now, every single night without fail, the boy looked up at him with his mother's steady eyes and asked the question he had asked once before, in a study, in his small socks, on a morning that had nearly cost him everything. "Papa," he said, "are the bad men coming?" And this time Marius did not laugh. He did not ruffle the boy's hair and reach for his bag and walk out the door to another life. He gathered his son up against his chest and he held him, and he told him the truth, which was the only thing he had left to give that was worth anything at all. "No," he said, "the bad men are not coming. Your mother saw them a long way off, before anyone else in the whole world could see them, and she stood in the door until I came home. No one is ever going to get past your mother and me. You can go to sleep now, Roan. You can put it down. The watch is ours now." The boy slept. Downstairs Marius found his wife standing at the window in the last of the spring light, and he came and stood behind her and wrapped his arms around her, and out across the melting river a bird was singing somewhere in the bare trees, and Cosima laughed at something, low and easy and unafraid, the sound he had spent 6 years running from, and would now spend the rest of his life making certain he heard every single day. He had spent one winter holiday in another woman's bed, and he had come home to a silent house and a cold nursery and a wife gone into the snow, and he had believed, for the length of one long terrible drive, that he had lost everything. He understood now that the house had been empty long before the night she left it. It had been empty every ordinary evening he sat at the head of that table, and failed to see the woman at the other end of it, the one who was quietly holding his entire world together with her bare and bleeding hands, and asking him for nothing, and waiting, year after year, for him to simply turn his head and look. She had not disappeared to leave him. She had disappeared because it was the only thing loud enough at last to make a blind man see. And when he finally opened his eyes in a freezing room at the end of the world, he found that the treaty he had married had been the whole empire all along, and the quietest person at his table had been holding the knife, the ledger, and his entire heart, the entire time. If this story pulled you in, if you felt that moment in the freezing room the way I hoped you would, then do me a small kindness and tap that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who believes, the way I do, that the quiet ones are always the most dangerous people in the room, and tell me down in the comments. What was the moment Marius should have seen it coming? I read everyone. I will see you in the next story.